Hello and welcome to Truth, Lies and Work, the award-winning psychology podcast brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. My name is Leanne. I am a business psychologist.
There's a reason why Leanne say it like that. She's not had an episode. My name is Al. I'm a business owner.
We are here to help you simplify the science of work.
We're also here to help you simplify something else, which is exactly what Leanne alluded to a second ago. So welcome to the Thursday episode where we have these in-depth interviews. We've got a couple of great guests for you today. If you've not checked out our Tuesday episode, then it's just a bit more like of a magazine show. So we have the sort of news roundup, and then we have a surprise segment in the middle, and then the world famous weekly Workplace. I need to learn.
You need to change the freaking name, man.
We have the Workplace Surgery where I put your questions to Leanne and she answers them.
Yes, so welcome to Thursday's episode.
Today, we are calling out the elephant in the room. We are finally asking the question that at this point, you might be afraid to ask. What is a business psychologist?
Yes, you have heard me introduce myself as a business psychologist now for exactly 110 times. And there's only one episode actually back from 2022 that explains what a business psychologist is, and that is my origin story, episode 17, if you're interested. You've probably heard it called other stuff too, looking around online or in the workplace. Maybe you've heard of an organizational psychologist, an occupational psychologist, or a work psychologist. And then you're probably wondering, isn't it all just HR? Well, today we are answering all of those questions for you.
Yes, we'll be asking what is a business psychologist and how is it different from other flavors of psychologist. We're going to be asking what do these workplace psychologists actually do? Thirdly, how do I pick a credible expert? And fourthly, what should I expect when I'm working with a business psychologist? Since we've launched our Tuesday episode, we've answered a lot of questions related to choosing a career or navigating a career transition. So we'll also touch on how to become a psychologist.
Yep, and finally, we'll walk you through a brief case study of a culture change and an example of how not to do it, brought to you perhaps ironically by the British Psychological Society, but more on that beef later. We have two awesome guests joining us today to help us answer all of these questions and probably a couple more. First, let's meet Dr. Hayley Lewis. Hayley is a chartered coaching psychologist and HCPC registered occupational psychologist. See, we're throwing terms at you already. They will be explained. Hayley is also Program Director for the MRes Professional Practice in Occupational Psychology at Birkbeck University in the UK and is a lecturer at City University of London. She is also a renowned sketchnote doodler and proud pracademic. She is committed to making psychology accessible. Let's meet Hayley.
I'm Hayley. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I am I like to say I've got dual citizenship at the British Psychological Society. So I'm an occupational psychologist and a coaching psychologist. I've been in the field 25 years. But during that time, I haven't always been in psychology roles. I've spent time in leadership and management roles in the public sector. I think probably now at this point, I'm most famous for my sketch notes. Not a day goes by when someone doesn't drop me a line about them or ask me about them or request a copy of a certain sketch note. And when I go to conferences or when I'm teaching students, they'll go, "Oh, you're the one who does the sketch notes." So yeah, that's probably what I'm now most famous for as a psychologist.
Our second guest is Paula Brockwell. Paula is a chartered occupational psychologist, culture strategist, and coach. She was lead psychologist at Robertson Cooper. That is, we've had Sir Kerry Cooper on the pod. He is the grandfather, the OG. And in 2018, she founded the Employee Experience Project, where she pioneers an evidence-based approach to upskilling and supporting strategic HR leaders to deliver impactful cultural change. Let's go meet Paula.
Yeah, well, I'm Paula Brockwell. What do? I help people have great experiences at work, but really with a focus on supporting businesses to really succeed by creating environments where people can bring the best they can to work. It's an awesome job. And what am I famous for? Well, it depends what circles, really. Around Sheffield's way, I'm known for my specialism for helping ladies over 70s either start running for the first time or get back into it after a long break. So that's probably a story for another time. But yeah, that's one of my favourite things to do.
We will be coming back to Paula later in the episode as she shares a case study for culture change. But for now, let's start at the beginning. We asked Hayley, what is a business psychologist and how is it different to an occupational psychologist or an organizational psychologist, or a work psychologist?
They're not different. They're all part of the same family. So occupational psychology is about the science of the workplace, so understanding kind of what makes individuals, teams and whole organizations tick. There are 5 kind of core areas of occupational psychology. So, and anybody training as an occupational psychologist will need to demonstrate their proficiency across all 5 areas. So we're taught about psychological assessment at work. So that covers everything around personality testing, assessment centres, selection, well-being at work, which is really kind of gained traction over the last few years. Certainly well-being at work wasn't a core requirement when I trained back in 1999. But that's about kind of health and well-being in the workplace, mental health, kind of well-being, resilience. There's leadership engagement and motivation, which is my day-to-day work. So everything from how we support leaders at an individual level, how we design, deliver and evaluate the effectiveness of leadership development interventions, how we motivate people so they can do their best work and kind of be their best selves. There's learning, training and development, which is the 4th area, which does exactly what it says on the tin. And then there's work design, organisational development and change. So that can be everything from redesigning processes and systems all the way up to kind of big whole scale whole system culture change, or supporting organisations with mergers and acquisitions. So it's such a rich and diverse profession.
So business psychologists, organizational psychologists, occupational psychologists, work psychologists, they all work in the same field and across those 5 core areas, including recruitment, training and organizational development. So how is this different from HR?
I think to date, what's differentiated us is, as occupational psychologists, kind of the backbone of what we do is about evidence-based practice. So designing things with a really good evidence base, looking across the different range of evidence, everything from scientific studies through to kind of what stakeholders are saying, through to what expert professionals are saying, to what the context is saying. But in recent years, we've seen more and more come online to support HR professionals to be more evidence-based. So what differentiated us, I think we've now got in common, I think, because I used to work in HR for a long time, I think in terms of traditional HR, there's still that focus on employee relations, on kind of protecting the organisation and protecting employees' rights. So engagement with unions, making sure there are good policies and processes in place, the kind of the mechanics around employee rights, everything from kind of grievances and disciplinaries and kind of, and then the mechanics around change, such as, you know, if there's a 2P transfer and all that stuff, that stuff typically occupational psychologists won't get involved in. We might work alongside and in partnership with HR. So if I think about work that I've done with HR colleagues, they would be working on the kind of the intricacies of mergers and acquisitions and the contractual arrangements that need to be changed for staff and the terms and conditions. And then my role was around the kind of psychological support that can be put in place for staff maybe affected by a merger or acquisition. And we're kind of 2 halves of the same coin, if you like.
In the UK, there are 2 main organisations that represent psychologists and assess levels of practice. They are the British Psychological Society, or the BPS, and the Association for Business Psychology, or the ABP. This leads us to our first tip. If you are looking for an expert, check if they have membership to these organisations and be sure you understand what their level of membership means, because pretty much anyone can be an associate member of an organisation or an association, whereas other levels require proof of knowledge and or experience. So for example, under the ABP, I've achieved the Certified Business Psychologist status. The BPS represents all psychology, not just my field. So here's more from Hayley on how the society works and how it can help to protect you when you're choosing an expert.
At its heart, the society is responsible for ensuring the high quality of the profession, and through that, the high quality of education of psychologists. That's it in a nutshell. It doesn't say it should be responsible for delivering that education, but it is responsible for ensuring various programs around the UK operate at the required standards and kind of overseeing that. And then alongside that, supporting professional development of psychologists.
Now, this is important because, again, it gives us another clue as to how to pick a credible expert. In the UK, people in the field of business psychology or organizational psychology have 3 levels of training they can progress through to have their practice recognized by this BPS. Remember, that's the British Psychological Society. First is an undergraduate degree in psychology. The second is a master's degree in organizational psychology. And finally is a chartership within the BPS. We're going to come back to chartership shortly.
It's also essential that these courses, these undergrad, postgrad courses, are BPS accredited, which means they've met rigorous criteria. It's a hallmark of quality. And that leads us to tip number 2. Check where your expert studied and if their course was accredited by the BPS. There is a list of accredited courses on the BPS website if you want to see if your expert completed an accredited course. Of course, a big caveat here, the BPS also recognises other routes. For example, if you did a history degree, you can complete a postgraduate conversion course and then go on to complete an accredited master's programme, and so on. There's lots of different variations. We're trying to keep it as simple and straightforward as possible here. If you would like more information on this, you can head to the BPS website or get in touch and we'll help you explore your options.
Okay, let's just recap what we know so far. Business psychologists, organizational psychologists, and work psychologists are interchangeable titles to describe a profession that applies psychology or behavioral science to the workplace. All are going to be likely to work within 5 core areas, as mentioned, which are, just to remind you, psychological assessment at work, including recruitment, learning, training and development, well-being, organizational development and change, and finally the 5th one, leadership, motivation and engagement.
Yep, geography may also make a difference in terms of what people choose to be called. So in the US, industrial and organizational psychologist tends to be the dominant title, just for example. And of course, how different countries regulate the field will influence the titles that are used. Here is Hayley to explain how this works in the UK.
I think the reason why we get people referring to themselves as work psychologists or organisational psychologists is because of the rules and regulations. So legally, you can only call yourself an occupational psychologist if you are chartered and registered with the Health and Care Professions Council. So it's a legally protected title. And so if I'm not chartered, if I'm not registered, the way I get around that is by calling myself a work psychologist or an organisational psychologist, because there are no legal ramifications.
Now, this is a key difference. In the UK, becoming an occupational psychologist requires you to achieve chartered status with the British Psychological Society. The use of chartership is legally restricted, so much like a chartered accountant or a chartered engineer. To become chartered, you need to undertake what the BPS calls Stage 2 training, which is a practice-based doctoral level qualification, basically proving that as a psychologist, your practice, your project work with clients is at a doctorate level. Once you've achieved this qualification, you're then eligible to become a registered psychologist with the Health and Care Professions Council, or the HCPC. And when you have both, you're legally allowed to use the title of occupational psychologist. So in really simple terms, if a practitioner is calling themselves an occupational psychologist, they have demonstrated their competence at the highest level in all 5 core areas of workplace psychology, which leads us to tip 3. If you're looking for the best of the best, choose an occupational psychologist.
If you're saying to yourself, hang on a minute, I didn't know any of this, and don't worry, you're not alone, because I didn't know this until I met Leanne. I would thought that if someone was a psychologist or called themselves a psychologist, they were legit. That's not always the case. Anyone, qualified or not, can call themselves a psychologist, and some do. Hayley explained that this is a critical issue and one that many psychologists are trying to address.
I think we've protected the wrong bit of the title. So in Australia, for example, Australia and New Zealand, they're really strict. They've protected the term psychologist. You cannot call yourself a psychologist unless you've met the kind of the education and skills requirements. For me, it always comes back to who are we protecting and why? And for me, we should be protecting the public. We should be helping the public make a really informed decision about who they are hiring, who they are paying for, and what credentials they have. Now, look, I'm not saying just because somebody's an HCPC registered and a chartered psychologist that they're better. We know that there can be some quite dodgy practice out there, but I think particularly if somebody's an HCPC registered psychologist, there is recourse for a member of the public to take action, to make a complaint, and to be protected to some degree.
You may also have noticed that some psychologists are also doctors, like Dr. Hayley. How does this work? Well, in really basic terms, being a registered psychologist with the HCPC refers to a standard in applied psychology or psychological practice. Gaining a doctorate is research-based. Birkbeck is one of the only universities in the UK that offers what is called a professional doctorate, a course that enables students to become a doctor, a chartered and an HCPC registered psychologist all in one bumper course. Here's Hayley to explain more.
So the MRes is the first part of the professional doctorate. So to get on the MRes, you need to have already done your undergrad and you need to have done your MSc in a BPS accredited occupational psychology or equivalent program. So the MRes is the equivalent of the BPS stage 2 qualification. I did the BPS route where you're kind of on your own. You have your supervisor, but it can feel quite lonely. Whereas the MRes program, the reason people say they choose to do that one is because they want the community, they want that kind of wraparound support, but it is really the community and the network that maybe you don't get. And so the MRes is 2 years. Our trainees are producing 6 practice logbooks. They do an assessed presentation, and they can either end there, and at the end of that they are HCPC registered psychologists, which is the legal regulatory and I think sometimes the more important bit, or they can apply to part 2, which is where you do your doctoral thesis, and at the end of part 2 you are, if you pass your Viva, so you produce a 55,000 word thesis, you do 2 big empirical studies, you do a Viva where you're put through your paces for often 2 to 3 hours by 2 professors, and you defend your doctoral thesis, and if you pass that then you are conferred the title of doctor and you get your chartered psychologist status. So it's a 4 to 5 year journey, and the MRes is the first part of that.
Okay, Leah, at this point, I think we should ask the important question. You call yourself a certified business psychologist. Why?
Well, a few reasons. One, people know what it means, or they think they know what it means. It's also kind of just a nice little intro to the podcast, isn't it? Business psychologist, business owner, and people get it. Second, when I graduated, I was working in industry and coaching and management roles. So chartership wasn't required or even necessary in terms of qualification. When I went self-employed, I thought it was a good opportunity to consolidate my experience and prove to the world and myself, if I'm being honest, that I was operating at a doctorate level, at the level of an occupational psychologist. And I am. Chartership takes a long time. Typically, case study projects are 6 to 12 months in length, and you need to undertake research as part of that. I started in 2020 and I've just completed this month. I was hoping actually to introduce myself in the episode as an occupational psychologist, but the paperwork is taking a little while. And as we've heard, for legal reasons, I'm not able to do that. And we have a content calendar to adhere to, Al. So there you go. Very soon I will be introducing myself as an occupational psychologist or a chartered psychologist or a registered psychologist or none of them. I'm thinking that Marketing Al might prefer simply business psychologist.
Maybe.
there is another important reason, of course. It means that my clients can be reassured that I'm operating at the highest level and I'm regulated, which means they're protective. If I mess up, there are professional and potentially legal consequences. And as an individual, it means that my career may also be future-proofed. Here's Hayley to explain a bit more.
We know the regulatory landscape is ever evolving, and I think we're going to see some big changes in the next 10 years, particularly in coaching, because this is something I get asked a lot. So I run my business, but also I have a part-time academic role running the first part of the professional doctorate at Birkbeck. And whenever people reach out to talk about coming onto the doctorate and the investment, the time, the money, the energy, they kind of ask me what the benefits are. And I always talk about you're protecting yourself and your professional identity in the long term in the light of potential regulatory changes. So I think it's going to become increasingly difficult to tout your services as a coach if you don't certain regulation, you don't have certain qualifications behind you. I think it's going to become increasingly difficult to tout your services in the field of occupational, organisational work, business, whatever you want to call it, psychology, if you don't HCPC registration, for example, if you're not a chartered member of the BPS.
Now we know what an occupational psychologist is and how to pick a credible expert, let's explore for a second what it's like to work with them. I want to start by understanding why and when you might need to engage an occupational psychologist.
I think a good occupational psychologist who is always working on their continuing professional development will bring a depth of understanding of scientific/research approaches to projects and work, but also a really good understanding of psychological concepts that can be helpful for clients in a way potentially that other professionals are less likely to have. So I'll give you an example. So I was asked to give a keynote talk for a public sector organisation on change. And there's lots of change experts out there. My take on it was around the psychology of change, and I shared some tools and techniques that I've learned as a psychologist and I use and apply, which are underpinned by cognitive behavioural therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy, things that maybe other change practitioners are maybe less likely to draw upon. And that actually led to some other work. So somebody attended that talk and then got in touch because their organisation is being disbanded. It's a major change. The organisation is an arm's length organisation in the public sector. It's having a big psychological impact on the staff, and the chief executive of this organisation that's closing actually wanted change support for their staff from a psychologist because she really liked some of the deep techniques that I shared.
Hayley also explained that occupational psychologists are obsessed with solving the root cause of the problem.
Yeah, again, I think it's that rigor, that rigorous approach, evidence and research. So, and knowing how to design really good diagnostics. I think that's one of the things that differentiates us. I think about, and you'll have heard of them, no doubt. So you've got Dr. Rachel Lewis and Dr. Joanna Yarker of Affinity Health have been doing groundbreaking work around mental health, physical health, well-being, burnout in the workplace. And their library of resources on their website is phenomenal, and it's underpinned by exceptional research-based approaches to supporting organisations. So their research supports organisations in dealing with the root causes, not the symptoms. And I think all too often I will see maybe practitioners who are not in our field respond to a client's request that deals with the symptom. I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, not a week went by when, particularly in the second to third year, not a week went by when I didn't have an organisation reach out and say, could you run some resilience training for our staff? Or could you run some wellbeing training. And my question always to the organisation is why? What's the needs analysis? Can I see the needs analysis that sits behind this? I also ask them what else is going on in the organisation that is supporting a healthy workplace culture. Because 9 times out of 10 there wasn't any of that, and actually it was all being put at the door of individuals. The reason you're stressed is you just can't cope, and so we're going to put you through sheep dip resilience training or sheep dip well-being training, and actually it fails to deal with the fact it's not the individual, it's because jobs have been cut but the work hasn't gone anywhere, and now you've got a person doing the role of 2 or 3 people. No human can do that. And so I think as psychologists, yes, we can support the individual, but we also do work to find out what else is going on in the system, and to really pin down what the root causes are. And then we can create interventions that get to the heart of that and help with that.
This is probably the most important thing to focus on when you're choosing an expert. Choose somebody who asks lots of questions first. They do some exploration, investigation, and then offer you a solution. As psychologists, our practices are driven by ethics, and we won't offer you a solution unless we're confident it will have an impact and do no harm. We too at Oblong have turned down clients if we think we're not convinced by their intentions.
This leads us nicely into our case study with chartered occupational psychologist Paula Brockwell. I interviewed Paula a few weeks ago, and we covered everything from arsehole bosses to major change programs. I want to join the interview when I'm asking Paula about her experience with organizations that address the symptoms rather than the root cause. So I saw something on, I think you posted on LinkedIn recently about a manager who was kicking off because he or she, I don't think it was identified, had implemented a mindfulness app, bought it for everyone, and then was still hadn't seen any kind of results from it. Why aren't you working harder? Why aren't you getting better? Have I got that story right? Tell us a story behind it.
To be honest, it's a bit more of a poke at a lot of my time in boardrooms whenever I worked at Robertson Cooper, where the kind of it's a lot in the culture world, whether it's well-being or not, where people ask you to come in and do culture work. You look at the whole system and you say, look, this is what's broken. And they go, yeah, but look, I bought this bandage and I've put it over. And why is that not having the effect? Why is that person still bleeding out? Because I put a Superman spider over that gaping wound that broken fence gave them. And I make them walk past that fence every day and they scratch themselves every day, but they're still moaning and I gave them a whole Spider-Man sticker. I think that is endemic, I think, in the culture change space, whether that's well-being based, whether it's kind of the more broader space that I work in now. And I've been really, honestly, I think the work that I've been doing over the last 6 years in the Employee Experience Project has been a little bit, sleep deprivation fueled because I had a couple of kids during that time, but like rage fueled, honestly, acting out I'm not playing this game anymore. I'm not coming home and thinking, have I helped there, or have I just enabled this broken system to badge those people up, bandage them up and send them back out again? So our approach is, I only work with clients now where we're saying, let's step back, look at the whole ecosystem, know what your ideal culture is and where you're trying to go, and make sure that's positively referenced. And then let's step back and look at the whole ecosystem. And that doesn't mean we unpick the whole business at once, but let's start making meaningful change to the true bits of the true drivers of culture, rather than just buying mindfulness apps, which, might help some people some of the time, but it's not going to solve a chronic culture of over-engagement and overwhelm. It's never going to solve that problem. So yeah, you've probably picked up on my sarky comments that I do via gnomes on LinkedIn in the hope that it makes me seem like I'm less grumpy about the whole thing.
Nothing wrong with being grumpy. You just said they're the drivers. It's not necessarily the drivers of culture. So what are the drivers of culture? Give me an example of how I know I'm got to get these drivers of culture in place.
So we dashboard them. I honestly, I think that one of the things that I learned through my years of culture consultancy was that most of us as consultants have got really used to having a really kind of inherent understanding of those in the back of our heads. And we go through and we see the data, but we create these reliant relationships with organizations where we're like, let's run it through the black box. And here's the 4 or 5 things that you need to do. And so I decided that I was going to get whatever that black box was out of my own head, and did a thematic analysis across think it was 52 in the end, 52 different cultural inquiries that I'd done over the course of my career, looking at, well, what are the things that we most report, most action on, and what's the data telling us? And I built a dashboard off that, which identifies 4 areas, really, 4 pillars that you can work with. And they've all got subcategories in there. But one of them is leadership tone. So how are your leaders showing up? What examples are they showing? But also, what choices are they making around strategic planning, resourcing, etc.? That absolutely influences how it feels in our business and what the rules of engagement are. A piece around management capability and kind of action. So what does that look like? And how's the shadow of the leader playing out in those managers, and what capability do they have, and what microclimate are they creating within their own particular areas? I think there's a massive bit then about colleagues, which comes down to a lot of it's about their narrative about an organisation. So what's the stories that they tell themselves? What's important to them? How much connection do they have to the organisation, etc. And then the other thing, the final pillar for us, is really around systems and processes. So how have the actions, views, behaviours of those other 3 groups really started to embed themselves into the organisation? Because one of the things I really notice is that businesses will do they often really focus on the manager. If we just train this out of them without thinking about, well, what are the leaders actually telling them to do and rewarding them on and making it possible for them to do? But one of the things we really don't pay attention to is, but what systems and processes are they caught in? So we're telling them to take more personal responsibility, as an example. That's a big bugbear with a lot of organisations that I work with, that they just never step up and do anything. But if we've given them a delegated authority line that they can only sign off £500 budget because we've got an over-controlling leadership team that decided that 10 years ago and kind of forgot about it, then we're never going to drive that personal responsibility, because give them as much training as we want and show them as many values that have got something about personal responsibility and forging ahead and bravery in there. If the leadership team is actively suppressing them, maybe unconsciously, but actively suppressing them with their behaviour, and the systems and processes are forcing them to double check everything and sign it off 47 times, you're never going to activate that group into personal responsibility. So that's my view around really how you take that more systemic approach to looking at those micro behaviours that either you want to eradicate or you want to encourage, and saying, well, let's look across the whole system and say, where is it helping or hindering those behaviours from happening? And then starting to re-engineer all of that, making small shifts in all of that ecosystem so it adds up to something that makes it really natural for people to take personal responsibility rather than fighting against it. So it's I don't work with organisations that just want to put a mindfulness nap in, or a mindfulness app in, try that, or just want you come and do a team day because everybody's a bit miserable. I guess it's the psychology training in me. I see that there is cause and effect. We make decisions, we give behavioural cues, we create opportunities, and that makes the behaviour of our colleagues pretty much like a 1 + 1 = 2. So if we want a different number out of the end of the equation, we've got to change the numbers going into that equation to make that happen. It's not something, people don't just come to work to be rubbish. There is typically something in the environment that is encouraging those behaviours and making them functional.
I love that. People don't come to work to be rubbish. I love that. So you're a chartered occupational psychologist, fancy letters after your name, all kinds of bits and pieces. But what about those people who potentially can't afford to bring someone like you in, or want to just test the water before they actually invest in someone like that? Are there some simple, let's keep it simple, so that someone who doesn't understand necessarily all the fancy words that psychologists know, what are some of the simple things they can do to either make a quick improvement so they can prove there's a way that they can invest in it, or just do something if they haven't got the money?
I think the first step is always going to be, how do we want it to be around here from a leadership point of view? What is it that we need to get from people? And then have a conversation with your staff about how you get that, really listen and do some quick wins with them. So it depends on if I'm honest, it depends on your starting point. My default is always, as soon as possible, activate your whole business around being the change that they seek. But it really depends on the history of listening, trust, and a kind of colleagues feeling like they can be safe enough and they've got the permission to do something different. So if you're already in that place that you're just a bit stuck, you're genuinely got that sense of listening and trust and kind of safety, but things have just got a bit stuck, I'd be saying, set your standard. This is how we want people to behave around here. This is how we want it to be around here. And this is how we want people to feel. I think that's an important part of it as well, the emotional piece. So do that little bit of thinking and work in line with your strategy and where you're going. And then really quickly get out with colleagues and say, how do we do this? What do we do? And listen to people, give them the space to do some of those things. If it's within their gift, ask them to do it and praise them and support them and remove the blockers for them to do it. But if it's a bigger business problem, listen and fix it really loud and show people that you're fixing it in a loud way. And I think in doing that, you build trust that something can be different and you're encouraging people to do things differently, and it'll start to move things forward. So at all points, you've just got to build that sense of momentum and agency with people and get them going. But there's no point in just doing some stuff. It's got to make sense, which is why I say start with that. This is how we want it to be around here to achieve this in our strategy, because then that makes sense to people. It's not just like, oh, more pizzas. Okay, let's see what we can do around that.
You used a phrase there I really like, fix it loud. Now, can you, I think I understand what it means, but can you explain what that means, why it's important? And if you have an example of someone who's fixed it loud, that'd be phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely. So fix it loud for me is about, well, a few things really. Really consciously accepting and acknowledging that there has been a challenge and a pressure point that's impacted colleagues there. So you're showing people that you hear them and you understand their experience. And then as you do whatever the re-engineering or the fixing is, you are telling people what you're doing, but also the impact that it's having. So I'm not saying do this in a survey. You said, we did way. I'm saying do this in a, you said, look what we're up to and we're asking you to get involved in. Look at the impact that it's had. Look at the next stage. So really talking to people about the flow through and the impact, so that you're building that sense of they are listening, they are helping, they are doing the difficult things that are going to make a difference. So it's really about that narrative and story the whole way through to really make things make sense, and not just stopping at the bit of, well, we're going to do it, we've heard it, and now we're planning to do it, but this is how we followed through on the plan, and this is the impact that it had. I think is massively important, and doing that as loudly as possible. And I suppose an example to give you, an organisation that I worked with probably about 18 months ago, massively kind of bureaucratic. All of their systems had become really caught and multifaceted, and just people ended up going round in circles and they didn't know who owned what. And they had a real issue with their purchasing process. So that's the, I make the joke about the 500 quid sign off, but they had that issue of literally, a business of about 1,800 people, and the highest budget line sign off was 500 quid, and the rest went to the exec. Like they must have just been signing purchasing receipts for 92% of their time. I don't know. Anyway, so what they did was they had a look at that process, the delegated authority process around budgeting. They very visibly raised that level around kind of what level of budget people could sign off on, but also they looked at the process for onboarding suppliers and managing suppliers, and massively reduced the amount of admin harassment. That's how the business experienced it, and barriers that people had to face. So this was a day-to-day pain point for the rest of the business, where the risk management of the system had got in control of something that really was blocking people's ability to just focus on their day job and get things done. And they just pulled it apart and fixed it in it was about an 8-week period. We planned it as a 6-week sprint, but it took about 8 weeks in the end to really get it right. But it really made a difference, and people saw visibly, oh, okay, we're willing to tackle the really tough things, and we're willing to let go of things that have been really painful for a long time to make sure that we can move forward. And it built a huge amount of goodwill and trust, and just an everyday reminder to people that every time they touched that system, which people did a lot, given what the business did, that every time they touched that system, it was suddenly easier, and it gave them a daily reminder that actually the business was serious about this change. So it's, it's not just about how you do it, it's about picking some of the visible stuff that is continual pain points, because then you're giving people that continual bump of emotion and reminder of trust that you're actually doing something differently.
That's best practice change management. We can also learn a lot from how not to do it. After I spoke to Dr. Hayley, the BPS announced a significant change in how occupational psychologists will be trained and supported in the UK. This was an unexpected change, and it really did send shockwaves through the occupational psychology community. As Programme Director at Birkbeck, Hayley isn't privy to the changes made by the BPS, but she does have skin in the game, not only as an occupational psychologist herself, but as an educator. So I reached out to Hayley after this announcement and picked up another conversation.
Right, you might be listening and thinking, this next bit doesn't affect me and I've heard enough. And you could well be right. If all you wanted to know was the difference between HR, business, occupational, organizational psychologist, then you can stop listening and you can go and have a cup of tea. However, if you are going to recruit an expert, then it's likely you're going to result in having to implement some change. So this final segment is going to be a great masterclass on getting it wrong.
Yes, for those in the psychology world, this is what the kids call a hot take. For everyone else, this is how not to manage change. Let's join the conversation where I'm asking Hayley to talk us through the BPS's decision. There has been a significant change in the British Psychological Society, the organisation that holds the standard for occupational psychologists and training in the UK. For anyone who isn't aware, can you maybe take us through what the changes is, the timeline of events?
I'm as on the outside as you are and as many of the listeners are, but what we do know, and the BPS did put a formal announcement out last week eventually, the proposal is to scrap the independent stage 2 qualifications in 3 divisions. So the division of occupational psychology, the division of counselling psychology, and the division of education psychology Scotland. I think it's fair to say that feels like it's come out of nowhere. I think it sent a massive shockwave because it wasn't expected. I think at the heart of this is just the kind of the seemingly poor approach to managing change and communicating to people and with people during change has made this much more a bitter taste and unsettling and upsetting and anger-inducing than it needs to have been. So there's all sorts of things going on, but that's at the heart of it. The proposal is to scrap the independent stage 2 across 3 divisions.
I mean, so with that in mind, like you say, the stage 2 has changed so many times over the last few years, but certainly the last 15 years. Why the fuss? If all the BPS is saying we're just going to change it, why is there this outrage? And as you said, the chief assessor of the stage 2 with the BPS, Gail, she said, in her LinkedIn post, something along, our profession is under threat. If it's just a change in program, why the outrage? Why the pushback?
When change is led badly, when change is communicated poorly, when there's a lack of consultation, meaningful consultation and engagement, this is the normal reaction. People will fill that void with rumour, with anxiety, and it almost like people will then feed each other. So I think that plays a part to some degree. I think the notion that the field of occupational psychology is under threat, I don't think the field's going to go away, but I think the threat that I see is what I talked about earlier, which is closing the door to people who won't otherwise be able to access the profession and becoming qualified because there's too few routes in, they're too expensive, they're too unwieldy. And so there's something about the choices that people make and how we help people make those choices. Because again, I suppose it calls into, we put importance on the terminology chartered psychologist. I know I do. I almost killed myself trying to get it because of the additional hurdles I had to jump a long time ago. But what does it mean to the public? Does it mean anything to the public? Does it mean anything to our clients? It was interesting. I was having a chat with another rock psych this morning, and we were saying, actually, when it comes to we call ourselves a psychologist. We don't use registered or chartered because it didn't mean anything to the average person. So that's going through my mind and lots of people's minds as well.
Am I right in thinking that even the division of occupational psychology, the committee, wasn't informed of the change before it was announced?
based on what I have seen come out from the DOP chair, yes, that seems to be the case. That seems to be the case. And so that for me gets to the heart of all that's wrong, is the lack of timely communication, but more fundamental than that, the seeming lack of respect and recognition of the importance of regular, meaningful, timely engagement and communication. Because it's not just about broadcasting stuff, it's about meaningful engagement, whether that's consultation or whatever, with members. And so when you're making big decisions, big change decisions, that feels like quite a big bit of information to have missing. And I'm not saying there isn't information that was explored. Again, it feels like, based on the messaging that's come out subsequently from the BPS itself, but also divisional chairs, qualifications leads, it feels like it's a purely financial driven decision. But even that being said, even when finance is at its heart, I still think the right ethical thing to do is to consult. You know, when I worked in local government, I was responsible for some major changes that affected residents and some of the most vulnerable service users. You know, we had 350,000 residents. You'd never dream, even when we had to make cuts, you would never dream of implementing that until you have engaged with the public to get their views, on how this should be implemented, you know. So why do we think we can do that here?
It is important to know that the BPS operates as a charity and has a management team that are responsible for its operation. The management team largely has a corporate background, so are not necessarily, and probably not, psychologists. The influence of psychologists comes through the board of trustees and other boards and committees. It appears as though this change was a management decision with little consultation with the people it would actually impact. And I think this is the key lesson here. If you want change to be effective, you need to bring employees into that change process, and ideally from the start through consultation. If you are currently on the stage 2 qualification, it's also important to know that the changes won't impact you. You will be able to complete your chartership. Of course, it's a very niche conversation, so we've only published the parts that are relevant to this episode. But if you would like to hear the full conversation with Hayley about the changes within the BPS, get in touch and I'll be happy to share that with you.
So if you want to find out where you're at with your culture, then Paula has a free EX index report. The link is in the show notes. Oh, and did we mention that she's worked with brands like John Lewis and Farrow and Ball? So you can connect with her on LinkedIn. The link's there. The website is theexproject.com. There's also a free culture change makers community called Spark, which you should definitely check out at theexproject.com/Spark.
Yes, and if you want to learn more about Dr. Hayley and specifically her sketch notes, she mentioned at the top there she is famous for them, and she really is. I think she's got 30,000 followers about now on LinkedIn. They are phenomenal, basically taking very complicated psychological theories, principles, and distilling them into a doodle. It's so good, and she's got more than 250 of them now. So do go check them out. You'll find them on her website, halopsychology.com, and of course on her LinkedIn and socials. We will leave links to those in the show notes.
Thank you to both our guests, incredible guests, and thank you for listening. If you've got any feedback, you know what to do. Go on LinkedIn, search for Truth, Lies and Work. Is there anything else to add, Leanne?
I don't think so. We're back again next Tuesday with another episode of This Week in Work. Until then, let us know your thoughts, feedback, sign up for the newsletter. We'll leave a link to that in the show notes too. And get in touch. Who do you want to see in the show? What should we be talking about? All that stuff.
Superb. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Yes, we're going to be asking. Why did I say asking? My name is Al. I'm a business owner.
There's a fly, Al.
There is. So introduce yourself. So we've got Leanne, we've got Al, and then we've got
Felix the fly. Where did you come from? Let's meet Hayley. Oh, who's in my face?
Poor love.
I know. Put that in the outtakes. That's quite funny.
I will do. So let's just recap.
Recrap.
If you're saying to yourself, I didn't know any of this, then don't worry, I didn't know this at all until I met.
You sound like a car then.
I know.